This is Game Over, Goodnight, calm stories from gaming's past, told to help you relax or fall asleep. If you're still awake later, a gentle subscribe means another story will be waiting for you tomorrow. Do you ever close your eyes and still hear it? The soft click of a power switch? The faint hum before a world appears? It's strange how a machine can hold so many memories. Not just games, but the nights we stayed up too late. The friends we made. The childhoods that never quite left us. Tonight, we travel back to a time when two consoles shaped not just an industry, but an identity. When the lights go out and the hum of the CRT fades into memory, a new sound begins to echo. The clack of a cartridge sliding into place. A spark. A logo. A world that's about to change. The 1990s were not quiet years. They were neon and thunder. A time when two titans collided not in boardrooms but in living rooms. It was the age of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System and the Sega Genesis. A rivalry so heated, so inventive, that it would shape gaming's entire future. Tonight, we drift through the 16-bit era, a golden age of speed, color, and marketing madness. A time when pixels were armies, sound chips were secret weapons, and every playground debate was a miniature console war. This is the story of how Nintendo and Sega, one the family-friendly empire, the other the streetwise challenger, waged a beautiful battle that changed everything. It begins, fittingly, with quiet confidence. By the late 1980s, Nintendo was unstoppable. The NES had revived the gaming industry from its crash and ruled with an iron controller. Mario, Zelda, Metroid. Names etched into the childhoods of millions. But just beneath that cheerful surface, something was stirring. In arcades, players were discovering a new kind of visual splendor. Sharper sprites, faster gameplay, deeper color palettes. The word 16-bit whispered through the neon halls like a promise of a better tomorrow. Nintendo knew the next generation was coming, but they weren't rushing. The NES was still printing money. Why hurry toward risk when you're the king? Sega, however, didn't have that luxury. They were the scrappy challenger watching from below. And in 1988, they saw their chance. With the Mega Drive, renamed the Genesis in North America, Sega would strike first. The Genesis was everything the NES wasn't. Sleek, black, angular. Not a toy, but a machine. Its slogan said it best. Genesis does what Nintendon't. It was a rallying cry to teenagers who had grown up with Mario and now wanted something edgier. The Genesis promised attitude, a word that would come to define the 1990s itself. Under the hood, Sega's console was built for speed. The Motorola 68000 processor, the same kind of CPU found in early Macintosh computers, gave it horsepower far beyond the NES. It could move more sprites, more colors, more sound, and crucially, do it all faster. When Sonic the Hedgehog would arrive a few years later, that speed would become its entire identity. But in these early days, Sega still needed something more dangerous than hardware. They needed personality. Nintendo was slow to respond. Internally, they were working on the Super Famicom, their 16-bit successor. But Nintendo's leadership, led by Hiroshi Yamauchi, preferred perfection over haste. They wouldn't release the Super NES until 1990 in Japan and a year later in North America. That gap, those two critical years, gave Sega a golden opportunity. While Nintendo was preparing their next masterpiece, Sega's American division was busy rewriting the playbook on how video games were sold. They didn't just want to compete with Nintendo. They wanted to make Nintendo look old. In an era before social media, the war was fought through commercials, store displays, and magazine ads, and Sega brought a new kind of swagger. Their messaging was sharp, irreverent, almost punk rock. A Sega ad might feature kids screaming into the camera, lights flashing, the words blast processing plastered across the screen, a term that meant almost nothing, yet sounded powerful. Meanwhile, Nintendo stuck to its trusted formula: wholesome, friendly, family safe. Two philosophies, two visions of gaming, and soon two very different kinds of magic. Two philosophies, two visions of gaming, and soon two very different kinds of magic. In 1991, the stage was set. Sega had planted its flag with the Genesis, and Nintendo was ready to answer. When the Super Nintendo finally arrived, it was a quiet revolution, not brash or loud, but confident, like a veteran walking onto the field. It wasn't about flash, it was about finesse. The Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES, was a marvel of balance. Its picture was cleaner, its colors richer, its sound, courtesy of Sony's custom SPC700 audio chip, was orchestral and warm. While Sega screamed about speed, Nintendo whispered about beauty. Where the Genesis was all edges and adrenaline, the Super Nintendo felt like a dream. It could rotate and scale backgrounds with Mode 7 magic, making racing games and flight simulators suddenly feel alive. F-Zero, Pilotwings, Super Mario World, each one a quiet showcase of the SNES's power, hidden beneath charm and polish. The battle wasn't just on the screen, it was cultural. Sega appealed to older kids, teenagers who listened to Nirvana and wore baggy jeans. Nintendo was for the family, the safe choice, the Saturday morning cartoon. Yet, deep down, both companies were selling the same thing: imagination. Sega, the rebel with a smirk, wanted you to feel cool. Nintendo, the stoic craftsman, wanted you to feel wonder. And somehow both succeeded. Throughout 1991 and 1992, the two consoles coexisted like rival kingdoms. Each had its champions. Each had its flagships. Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog burst onto the scene in a blur of cobalt blue. He was everything Mario wasn't: fast, cocky, and bursting with attitude. The moment he hit that first loop-de-loop, Sega had its identity. Sonic was a mascot with teeth. His smirk was rebellion, his speed a middle finger to slow and steady Mario. Sega leaned in hard. Commercials showed Sonic literally outrunning Nintendo's plumber. They called the SNES slow, mocked its image as a toy for kids, and it worked. For a time, the Genesis outsold Nintendo in America, something that had seemed impossible only a few years before. Sega's marketing blitz gave birth to a phrase that would define the decade: the console war. It wasn't just about games anymore, it was identity, pride, even morality. Kids argued about which system was better, like philosophers debating truth. If you owned a Genesis, you were fast, cool, independent. If you had a Super Nintendo, you were loyal, artistic, pure. On playgrounds, friendships were forged or fractured over which controller you held. And while the rivalry was fun on the surface, underneath it all, something profound was happening. Competition was pushing creativity to its limits. Developers were forced to invent new ways to stretch silicon. On the Genesis, programmers learned to squeeze color and speed from a smaller palette and tighter memory. They wrote assembly code that felt like poetry carved from math. On the SNES, designers used Mode 7 to bend reality, creating illusionary depth and movement long before 3D existed. Each console forced the other to evolve. In a way, the rivalry wasn't destructive. It was alchemy. Sega and Nintendo were refining each other through fire. By 1993, both systems were at their peaks. Sega had sports games and action titles that screamed with energy. Nintendo had RPGs and platformers that sang with emotion. And in the middle of all this competition, one of gaming's most defining years arrived: 1994. It was the year that the Super Nintendo hit its stride, and the Genesis began to feel the pressure. Nintendo released Donkey Kong Country, a game that looked impossible for 16-bit hardware. With pre-rendered 3D graphics and buttery animation, it stunned audiences and critics alike. People said the SNES was showing its age. Nintendo responded by showing its power. Meanwhile, Sega was trying to push boundaries of its own. With the Sega CD and the 32X add-ons, they tried to turn the Genesis into a platform that could do everything. CD-based games, early 3D, even full motion video. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. Consumers were confused. Which Sega machine were they supposed to buy? The base Genesis? The Sega CD? The new 32X? For every step forward, Sega seemed to take two sideways. Nintendo, steady as ever, stayed its course, polishing games until they gleamed. Titles like Chrono Trigger, Super Metroid, and Final Fantasy VI defined storytelling for a generation. Sega was the rock concert, Nintendo was the symphony. And as the music swelled, everyone could feel the curtain starting to close. The 16-bit era, the golden age, was nearing its end, but what an ending it would be. By 1994, the air around the industry felt electric, but also fragile. You could sense that something was about to change. For years, pixel art had been the language of games, but now another dialect was forming. Polygons, 3D space, a new kind of imagination that didn't fit neatly on a cartridge. Sega could feel it. Nintendo could feel it. And so could the players. At first it was exciting. The promise of the future always is. But for those who had grown up in the 8 and 16-bit worlds, that future also carried a quiet sadness, the feeling that a dream was ending. The Genesis was still fighting, but it was fighting uphill. Sega's constant hardware revisions had split its focus. Developers weren't sure which platform to support. Some embraced the new Sega CD's full-motion video experiments. Others stayed loyal to the original console. And yet, in living rooms across the world, the Genesis was still alive with noise and color. Games like Streets of Rage 2 and Gunstar Heroes burned bright. They were pure energy, fast, loud, confident. There was no time for subtlety. Meanwhile, Nintendo's SNES continued to evolve like a painter, perfecting their final masterpiece. Developers were finding ways to pull emotions from sprites that shouldn't have been possible. Chrono Trigger, with its branching timelines and melancholic score, felt like a meditation on time itself, almost prophetic for the era's coming end. Super Metroid showed how atmosphere could tell a story without a single word. Final Fantasy VI taught players that even in pixel form, characters could break your heart. Both companies were pushing the limits of what 16-bit could mean. But the world was moving on. The arrival of CD-ROM technology promised bigger worlds, real voices, even full-motion video. Sega tried to pivot with the Sega Saturn, and Nintendo prepared the Nintendo 64. But those machines belonged to a new era, the 3D generation. The 16-bit age, for all its glory, was now a relic of the past. Still, in those final years, the SNES and Genesis achieved something no one expected. They became timeless. The SNES aged like a beloved novel, elegant, patient, poetic. The Genesis aged like a record you still put on when you need to feel alive. Both consoles, in their own way, refuse to fade. And maybe that's why this story still matters. Because when we talk about the 16-bit wars, we're not really talking about processors or marketing slogans. We're talking about creativity under pressure, rivalry as a muse, competition that pushed art forward. Sega's aggression forced Nintendo to innovate. Nintendo's stability forced Sega to evolve. Without one, the other might have never reached their full potential. They were two sides of the same coin, the rebel and the craftsman, both chasing the same impossible dream, to make magic out of technology. When you look back now, it's hard to choose a winner. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe the victory belonged to us, the players, the ones who woke up on Saturday mornings, controllers in hand, believing the world fit inside that glowing box on the carpet. We didn't know it then, but we were living through history. Every flicker, every melody, every pixel, a brushstroke on the canvas of something far larger than we could see. And then, almost overnight, it was gone. By 1996, the next generation had arrived. The PlayStation, the Saturn, the Nintendo 64, sleek new machines that promised real 3D, cinematic sound, digital futures. The 16-bit consoles were quietly retired, boxed up, or handed down to younger siblings. But they never really left us. Even now, decades later, their soundtracks play in our minds like lullabies from a simpler time. The shimmering, overworld theme of Zelda, the rushing loops of Sonic, the soft click of a SNES power button. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was recognition. That feeling of discovery, of boundless possibility, of wonder you could hold in your hands. The SNES and Genesis didn't just compete, they defined what gaming felt like. They made it human. One taught us patience, craftsmanship, melody. The other taught us motion, rhythm, confidence. And when they finally bowed out, they left behind something greater than market, share, or sales charts. They left behind an era that proved games could be art. The 16-bit golden age wasn't perfect. It was messy, loud, and full of contradictions. But that's why we remember it. Because it was alive. It was the sound of childhoods growing up. And even now, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. A faint hum, a melody carried through time, whispering from an old cartridge that still works when you blow on it. This was more than a war. It was a symphony of pixels and passion. And as we drift to sleep tonight, somewhere in the static between channels, the ghosts of Sega and Nintendo are still dueling. Not out of rivalry, but reverence. Two visions, one era, forever 16-bit. Forever. In the years that followed, the echoes of the 16-bit war refused to fade. They lingered in the way we talked about games, the way we measured loyalty, even the way we argued about frame rates decades later. Sega and Nintendo had done more than sell machines. They'd created tribes. Sega's marketing was unlike anything before it, raw, kinetic, and shamelessly self-aware. Their ads weren't just commercials, they were challenges. They told you that owning a Genesis made you faster, cooler, louder. It was the same psychology that fueled sneakers, soda, and skateboards in the 1990s. Identity through purchase, rebellion through branding. Nintendo, in contrast, never shouted. It didn't need to. The company built its image on reliability, on being the safe harbor parents could trust. While Sega thrived on chaos, Nintendo thrived on control. Every game, every box, every sound effect passed through a perfectionist filter. And yet, both approaches worked. Because beneath the marketing, there was truth. The Genesis really was fast. The SNES really was beautiful. And that duality, speed versus grace, became gaming's yin and yang. The technical side of that war was its own quiet poetry. On paper, the SNES had the advantage. More colors, more audio channels, more effects. But Sega's engineers were magicians with limitations. They knew how to make less feel like more. The Genesis's sound chip, the Yamaha YM2612, was notorious for its gritty tone. To some ears, it was harsh. To others, it was raw energy. It gave us the thunderous bass lines of Sonic 2, the metallic crunch of Streets of Rage, the sharp punch of Golden Axe. That sound became Sega's fingerprint, bold, imperfect, human. Nintendo's sound, by contrast, was smooth and symphonic. The SNES's audio chip, designed in collaboration with Sony, could layer instruments like a miniature orchestra. It brought emotional depth to games in ways no one expected from a cartridge. When you listen to the sweeping strings of Final Fantasy VI, or the wistful flute of Zelda's Overworld, you're hearing the heart of that machine. Color, too, told the story. The Genesis could display 64 colors at once. The SNES could show 256. but Sega artists learned to use contrast and saturation to fake richness, while Nintendo's painters used subtle gradients to make skies melt into mountains. It wasn't about specs, it was about illusion. Developers became illusionists. They bent hardware to their will with tricks that bordered on witchcraft, tile swapping to simulate rotation, parallax layers stacked to mimic depth, palette cycling to fake water. They didn't have shaders or engines. They had ingenuity. Every limitation became a challenge to overcome. Every byte of memory was precious real estate. There were no day one patches, no updates, no online fixes. A cartridge had to be perfect the moment it left the factory. And maybe that's why these games endure. They were built to last, not because of nostalgia, but because they were engineered with care, patience, and constraint. Sega's programmers often joked that they worked in machine language dreams, typing code that spoke directly to silicon. Nintendo's teams, guided by legends like Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka, obsessed over feel, how Mario's jump should arc, how Link's sword should hum. It was science and art, wrestling in perfect balance. Behind the scenes, rivalries ran deeper than the commercials ever hinted. Sega's American branch, led by Tom Kalinske, pushed bold ideas that often clashed with Sega Japan's more conservative leadership. Meanwhile, at Nintendo, engineers debated every transistor of the Super FX chip that powered Star Fox's 3D graphics. Each breakthrough felt like a message to the other side. Star Fox's wireframe battles said, "We can do 3D too." Sega's Virtua Racing whispered back, "And we can do it faster." The result was a technological arms race, not fought with weapons but with wonder. By the mid-1990s, the 16-bit era had become a self-sustaining ecosystem of innovation. Magazines like Electronic Gaming Monthly turned console specs into scripture. Kids memorized frame counts and resolution numbers like secret codes. It wasn't just about playing anymore. It was about knowing, about belonging to something bigger than yourself, a culture, a conversation, a shared obsession. And that, more than any processor, was Sega and Nintendo's true legacy. They turned gaming from a solitary hobby into a community. There was something magical about being a kid in that era, when every playground became a miniature battlefield of opinions. You didn't need data sheets or frame counts. You just knew your system was better. You felt it in your heart, even if you couldn't prove it. Genesis kids bragged about Sonic's speed and blood in Mortal Kombat. Super Nintendo kids countered with Street Fighter II and Mario's colors that popped like candy. These weren't arguments, they were beliefs. Religion in pixel form. At school, lunch tables, and bus stops, myths spread faster than any ad campaign. Someone would swear there was a secret level in Sonic if you ran fast enough. Another kid would say he'd seen Luigi in Super Mario World, or that pressing a hidden button made Yoshi talk. You couldn't fact check it. There was no internet. Rumors were truth until proven otherwise. And somehow, those whispers made the games feel bigger than they really were. Endless, mysterious, alive. Video stores became sacred ground. Rows of plastic cartridges sat like treasure chests, each one promising a weekend of escape. You'd study the box art, the screenshots on the back, the tiny paragraphs that made every game sound like the adventure of a lifetime. Renting a game wasn't just a transaction, it was a ritual. You had 2 days, maybe 3, to experience something new, to conquer it before the return slots swallowed it back into obscurity. And if you loved it enough, you'd beg your parents to buy it next time. That's how word of mouth spread, one rental at a time, one story told in the schoolyard, one sibling convincing another that this game, this week, was the best ever made. Sega's edgier image appealed to kids who wanted to grow up faster. The Genesis had NBA Jam, Road Rash, and Mortal Kombat with all the gore left intact. It felt dangerous, thrilling, like you were getting away with something. Nintendo, ever the curator, censored the blood and softened the violence. Parents approved. Kids pretended not to mind. But deep down, even the most loyal SNES fan wondered what they were missing on the other side. That tension was part of the fun. It made choosing a console feel like declaring allegiance, a small rebellion, a statement of who you were. Looking back, it's easy to see how deliberate it all was. Sega had cracked the psychology of youth marketing. They didn't just sell fun, they sold identity. Their commercials were loud, brash, fast-cut montages that looked more like music videos than product demos. Nintendo's ads were warmer, slower, and full of wonder. Kids smiling under the glow of a living room TV. One promised adrenaline, the other promised belonging. Both were right. The console war didn't just sell hardware, it built culture. Kids wore Sonic t-shirts to school. Magazines ran Genesis versus Super Nintendo comparison charts that treated hardware specs like sacred texts. Friends formed alliances. Rivalries burned hotter than any marketing exec could have planned. In hindsight, it feels like the perfect storm. The timing, the tone, the technology, all of it collided at just the right moment. Sega's boldness made Nintendo sharper. Nintendo's polish made Sega bolder. It was a creative feedback loop, a rare moment in entertainment where competition birthed excellence instead of exhaustion. And maybe that's why even now people still debate who won. Because in a way, nobody lost. Sega's Genesis and Nintendo's SNES became more than consoles. They became symbols of taste, of memory, of youth itself. When people say they miss the 16-bit era, they're not just missing the games. They're missing the feeling of discovery, of ownership, of identity. The sense that you were part of something that mattered, even if it was just choosing between a blue hedgehog and a red plumber. Years later, when the internet arrived and nostalgia took root, that rivalry resurfaced in forums and comment sections. Sega fans defended their underdog heroism. Nintendo fans stood tall behind craftsmanship and legacy. And as grown-ups argued, kids who once fought over consoles were now sharing stories, realizing they'd lived through the same magic, just on opposite sides of the screen. It turns out that the console war never really ended. It just matured, softened, became a shared memory instead of a dividing line. Because in the end, both consoles taught us the same truth, that games aren't about winning or losing. They're about belonging to a story larger than ourselves. And in the 16-bit era, that story was everything. Behind the cartridges and commercials, the real war was being fought quietly, in fluorescent-lit offices filled with caffeine, circuit boards, and brilliant exhaustion. Developers on both sides were working miracles, trying to turn hardware limits into art. Every byte mattered, every frame had to sing, every delay could mean losing the race to the next holiday release. Inside Sega, a creative storm was brewing. The company had two very different souls. Sega of Japan, methodical and disciplined, and Sega of America, brash and impulsive. Japan wanted tradition, careful pacing, proven franchises, reverence for the arcade roots that had made Sega famous. America wanted revolution, faster production, louder marketing, and games that captured the raw attitude of the West. The tension between them was both a curse and a gift. That clash of cultures gave Sega its fire. Out of it came games like Sonic the Hedgehog 2, a product of international collaboration and chaos. The developers in Japan designed the framework, but the team in California tested, tweaked, and pushed until it screamed with speed. It wasn't easy. Late nights blurred into early mornings. The language barrier made communication slow, but the shared goal, make Sonic faster, smoother, bigger, overcame it all. When the game released, it wasn't just a sequel. It was a statement. Sonic had become a global icon, Sega's symbol of defiance. Over at Nintendo, the mood was different. The company didn't chase trends. It built temples. Its Kyoto headquarters moved at a deliberate, almost meditative pace. Everything was planned years in advance. Every line of code was treated like craftwork. The philosophy came from the top, from men like Shigeru Miyamoto, Gunpei Yokoi, and Ken Kudaraki. To them, games weren't products. They were living things. Miyamoto famously said that a delayed game could eventually be good, but a rushed one would be bad forever. That patience paid off. While Sega's hits came in waves of excitement, Nintendo's came like timeless monuments. The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, Super Mario Kart, Super Metroid, Earthbound. Each one was deliberate, layered, and lasting. But even Nintendo wasn't immune to the growing global pressure. The 16-bit market was booming, and the eyes of the world were turning toward Japan. In Europe, the Genesis was known as the Mega Drive, and it found its own following. A little rougher, a little darker. The games had a rebellious streak that resonated with European teens who saw Sega as the cooler alternative to Nintendo's squeaky clean image. In South America, particularly in Brazil, Sega became a legend. Through local distributor Tectoy, the Genesis stayed alive long after the rest of the world had moved on, spawning ports, exclusives, even TV shows. Nintendo had its own quiet empire, one built on trust. Its seal of quality, printed proudly on every box, meant something. Parents saw it as a guarantee. Retailers treated it like gold. Even competitors had to respect the discipline behind it. While Sega's personality was loud and unpredictable, Nintendo's was steady and serene. But both shared something sacred: belief in fun. Developers at the time often said it felt like working for rival religions. Sega's offices buzzed with energy and risk. Nintendo's halls hummed with focus and precision. Yet, across the ocean, both teams were unknowingly building the same thing: the foundation of modern gaming. As they competed, they also raised the bar. Sega's action games pushed reflexes and spectacle. Nintendo's adventures pushed story and emotion. Each forced the other to grow. And in that growth, the rest of the industry was watching, taking notes. Sony, for instance, was quietly learning. Working with Nintendo on the SNES's sound chip had given them a front row seat to the console market. The rivalry between Sega and Nintendo proved there was room for a third player, one that could blend style and structure, risk and reliability. The seeds of the PlayStation were being planted right there, in the soil of the 16-bit wars. As 1995 approached, Sega and Nintendo both stood at the edge of the unknown. The Saturn was ready, sleek and mysterious, boasting dual CPUs and the promise of true 3D. Nintendo, slow and cautious as always, was developing its own next step, the Nintendo 64, a cartridge-based 3D powerhouse. But as history would show, the world was about to change faster than either of them could keep up. The PlayStation was coming towards, and everything the SNES and Genesis had built was about to evolve. Still, even as 3D polygons began to fill screens, something about the 16-bit generation refused to die. The artistry, the restraint, the warmth, none of that could be rendered in higher resolution. It wasn't just nostalgia that kept the old consoles alive, it was soul. The fall of Sega's hardware empire didn't happen all at once. It came quietly, almost politely, like a storm that had already spent its rage. When the Sega Saturn launched, the energy that once defined the company felt different. There was pride, yes, but also confusion. 2 CPUs, complex architecture, an expensive price tag. It was a marvel of engineering that developers struggled to understand. Sega had always been bold, but this time their boldness fractured them. The magic that once lived in the Genesis, that perfect balance between style and substance, began to slip through their fingers. Meanwhile, Nintendo waited, patient as always. The Super Nintendo was still selling strong, still beloved, still alive in living rooms everywhere. Nintendo's next step, the Nintendo 64, would take years longer to appear. But even as the world shifted to polygons and disk drives, the SNES remained relevant. It was as if the console itself refused to admit it was old. In those years between generations, the contrast between Sega and Nintendo became poetic. Sega was racing toward the future, desperate to reinvent itself before anyone else could. Nintendo stood still, calm in its certainty that good things took time. Sega's brilliance was its downfall. Each risk, the Sega CD, the 32X, the Saturn, was an experiment ahead of its time. But in trying to lead, they stretched themselves thin. Nintendo, slow and deliberate, took fewer risks, but when it acted, the results were monumental. Super Mario RPG, Yoshi's Island, and Donkey Kong Country 3, each a swan song for 16-bit perfection. Those late SNES games weren't just releases, they were farewells. Developers poured their hearts into every line of code as if they knew it was the last time they'd work in that magical 2D space. Each pixel was painted with love, each melody composed with a touch of melancholy. Sega, too, had its final stand. Fantasy, Star, 4, Shining Force 2, Ristar, all shimmering examples of a studio giving everything before the curtain closed. The Genesis ended not in defeat, but in defiance. And when the 3D age finally took over, many players didn't notice right away. The leap from 2D to 3D was thrilling but awkward, beautiful and broken at once. Polygons replaced sprites, but not always with grace. Early 3D games were clumsy, their worlds foggy and empty compared to the painterly perfection of the 16-bit era. For a time, it felt like something had been lost. That's the paradox of progress. To move forward, something must be left behind. The 16-bit era was art through limitation. Every game a masterpiece of what couldn't be done. Once technology made everything possible, some of that magic faded. But the legacy of this SNES and Genesis lived on in spirit. Developers who grew up on those consoles carried their lessons into the new millennium. You could see Sega's influence in the energy of Dreamcast games like Jet Set Radio and Crazy Taxi, where attitude still reigned supreme. You could see Nintendo's craftsmanship in Ocarina of Time, Smash Bros., and Metroid Prime. Worlds built with the same patient precision that defined their 16-bit roots. The console war may have ended, but its fingerprints are everywhere. Even now, decades later, modern developers talk about the 16-bit feel, that intangible rhythm of design that makes a game satisfying, honest, alive. And as retro culture rose again, something wonderful happened. The war that once divided players became a shared memory. Collectors hunted down cartridges, not out of rivalry but reverence. Emulator screens flickered to life like digital campfires. Kids who never lived through the 90s discovered them anew and felt what we once felt. A sense of warmth, a sense of wonder. People began to realize that Sega and Nintendo hadn't been enemies. They'd been collaborators in spirit, partners in creating the era that defined fun itself. The console war wasn't really about destruction. It was about creation. Competition sharpened both blades until they could cut through the noise of mediocrity. It made games better. It made players passionate. It made childhood magical. And somewhere, deep inside every modern gamer, those old allegiances still flicker. Maybe you still feel it. That small electric pride when you see Sonic's blue streak or hear the opening notes of Zelda's theme. Maybe you still remember blowing into a cartridge just to make sure it worked and believing that somehow you'd fixed it with love. That's what the 16-bit era gave us. Not just games, but emotion. A sense that magic could live inside plastic shells and silicon chips. The Genesis and the SNES taught us how to dream with our thumbs. And for all their competition, they ended up telling the same story. One about creativity, connection, and the beautiful impermanence of technology. Because one day, every console becomes obsolete. But the feelings they gave us, those never age. The years rolled on, and the console war became legend. a bedtime story told by one generation of gamers to the next. By the 2000s, the battleground had changed completely. Sony, the quiet observer who once helped build the SNES's sound chip, now reigned supreme with the PlayStation. Sega, battered and weary, had stepped away from hardware altogether. The Dreamcast, brilliant, misunderstood, too far ahead, was their last great stand. Nintendo endured. It always did. From the Nintendo 64 to the GameCube, from the Wii to the Switch, its philosophy never really changed. It kept chasing that feeling. The wonder that began with a plumber leaping through a 16-bit sky. But even as technology evolved, something strange began to happen. Developers who grew up in the 16-bit age started making their own games, small, personal, handcrafted. And many of them didn't want photorealism or cinematic explosions. They wanted soul. They wanted pixels again. Games like Shovel Knight, Celeste, and Stardew Valley, all modern creations built with the heart of the 90s, carried that legacy forward. Not out of nostalgia, but reverence. These games weren't looking backward. They were reaching for the same purity of purpose that once defined Sega and Nintendo. Simplicity, emotion, craft. The indie renaissance wasn't just a return to the past, it was proof that the lessons of the 16-bit golden age still mattered. That constraints breed creativity. That art can live inside limits. That perfection is not in polygons or performance, but in feel. Sega's rebellious spark still flickers in every game that breaks rules just to see what happens. Nintendo's timeless care lives on in every design that values joy over spectacle. And when you step back, you can see it clearly. They weren't just rivals. They were two halves of the same heartbeat, one pulsing with rhythm, the other with melody. Together, they taught an entire generation how to play. Today, we have consoles that render worlds so lifelike, you can almost smell the air. We have cloud streaming, AI, upscaling, endless choice. But still, when people talk about their favorite era, the one that felt the best waits, they often return to the 16-bit days. Because that was when games stopped being novelties and started being memories. It was the moment the industry discovered heart. Maybe that's why, even now, collectors keep those old cartridges close. Why speedrunners chase perfect frame inputs on CRTS. Why cover bands still perform 16-bit soundtracks live, on stage, like hymns. The war ended, but the music never stopped. For some, the genesis was the sound of rebellion, of breaking rules and finding identity. For others, the SNES was a canvas of beauty, a place to feel safe, to dream, to lose yourself in worlds that felt infinite. And for all of us, those consoles were something bigger than brands. They were time machines. They froze a moment of human creativity so vivid that it refuses to fade even 30 years later. When you look at the glossy plastic shells today, they seem small, simple, almost quaint. But when you turn them on, when that familiar hum fills the room and a melody drifts through those tiny speakers, something ancient stirs, you remember who you were. The smell of the carpet, the glow of the TV, the way the world disappeared for a while and nothing existed but you and the game. And suddenly you realize the truth. The console war wasn't about competition at all. It was about connection between creators and players, between childhood and imagination, between the past and the endless now. Two companies fought for dominance. What they gave us instead was belonging. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift through memory, think of that soft click of the power button, the opening notes of a song you haven't heard in decades, the pixelated horizon that once felt infinite. Those worlds are still there, waiting. And maybe, in their own way, they've been waiting for you. Because no matter how far we go, no matter how sharp the resolution or how vast the storage, part of us will always return to those colors, that music, that glow. 2 consoles, 1 generation. A golden age that will never come again, but will never truly end. Goodnight, 16-bit world. Every great story has its magicians, the ones who pull impossible things out of wires and code. In the 16-bit age, those magicians were programmers, composers, and artists working with almost nothing, yet somehow creating everything. To most of us, the games just appeared perfect and complete. But behind those cartridges were months, sometimes years, of invisible labor. Developers pushed machines until they screamed, working through the night in small, dimly lit offices that smelled like solder, ramen, and ambition. The technology was primitive by today's standards, but the artistry was not. Every sound, every frame, every line of code was a balancing act between dream and limitation. Consider the sound chips. On paper, Sega's Yamaha YM2612 and Nintendo's Sony SPC 700 were just numbers and specs. In practice, they were instruments, each with its own soul. The Genesis chip spoke in metal and motion. It thrived on distortion, on bending sound until it snapped. Composers like Yuzo Koshiro and Masato Nakamura turned its imperfections into rhythm. Listen to the opening of Streets of Rage 2, that pulsing, crunchy bassline, and you can feel the concrete streets under your feet. It wasn't clean. It was alive. Nintendo's SPC 700, on the other hand, was a symphony in a box. Composers like Nobuo Uematsu and Yasunori Mitsuda used its sampling capabilities to make music that felt impossibly human. When Chrono Trigger's main theme swells, it's not just sound, it's longing, the kind that lingers even after the game ends. These weren't just songs. They were acts of rebellion against the limits of hardware. Artists faced similar challenges. The SNES palette was vast, but memory was tiny. Every pixel had to earn its place. Sprites were like brushstrokes, too many, and the frame rate would buckle. Too few, and the illusion fell apart. Developers learned to cheat. Parallax scrolling made backgrounds move at different speeds, creating depth from flat images. Palette shifting faked lighting. Animated tiles made water, ripple, and fire burn. None of it was real. It was illusion, theater, sleight of hand. But that was the beauty of it. It wasn't about power, it was about imagination. When Nintendo unveiled Mode 7, the SNES's ability to scale and rotate backgrounds in real time, it changed everything. Suddenly, racing games could tilt and soar. Airships in Final Fantasy VI didn't just move. They glided over spinning landscapes, and yet even that was an illusion, a clever manipulation of two-dimensional planes dressed up to look three-dimensional. The same was true for Sega's programmers, who invented pseudo 3D through brute force. Games like Outrun and Thunder Force 4 used line scrolling and perspective tricks to simulate motion that the console wasn't technically capable of. What they lacked in polygons, they made up for in poetry. And then there were the translators, the unsung heroes of the console war. Localization was still new, often done under tight deadlines and tighter budgets. Entire scripts were rewritten to fit cartridge space or cultural standards. Sometimes those compromises became legends. Final Fantasy VI's Son of a Submariner, a line born of censorship and creativity, became iconic. Earthbound's quirky dialogue, full of warmth and odd humor, turned a commercial disappointment into a cult masterpiece. The 16-bit era was the birthplace of localization as art. Translators weren't just converting words, they were shaping experiences for entirely different cultures. And while the fans argued about who had the better graphics or faster CPU, the people behind the scenes were united by something deeper: love for the craft. They didn't see competition the way players did. Sega developers played Nintendo games. Nintendo engineers studied Sega's arcade boards. They admired each other, even envied each other, because deep down they were fighting the same battle. Not against each other, but against limitation itself. That's what makes this era so special. It wasn't defined by what was possible, it was defined by what wasn't. And yet, somehow, the impossible kept happening. It happened every time a programmer fit an epic story into a few megabytes. Every time a composer made a cartridge sing like a full orchestra. Every time a child turned on their console and stepped into a world that shouldn't have been able to exist. That's the secret magic of the 16-bit golden age. It was built on boundaries and the joy of breaking them. By the mid-1990s, the 16-bit consoles had done something extraordinary. They had escaped the screen. The war between Sega and Nintendo was no longer confined to living rooms. It had spilled into magazines, classrooms, and every corner of pop culture. Gaming had become a language. And everywhere you looked, people were speaking it. Magazines were the social media of the era, tactile, colorful, and full of secrets. Electronic Gaming Monthly. Nintendo Power, GamePro, Mean Machines. Their glossy pages carried rumors like gospel. Each issue smelled of fresh ink and electricity. You could almost feel the energy humming off the paper. Screenshots were windows into worlds most kids hadn't yet played. A single image of Mega Man X or Phantasy Star 4 could keep you daydreaming through an entire school day. Codes, cheat maps, and developer interviews were treated like relics, proof that the universe of games was deeper than it looked. And then there were the covers. Sonic posed with arms crossed and a smirk. Mario smiled, timeless and cheerful. It was more than marketing, it was mythology. The print world gave players a sense of belonging. You didn't need the internet, you just needed the next issue. Those magazines taught a generation how to read critically, how to compare, how to debate. They turned kids into critics long before the word influencer existed. Meanwhile, in the real world, the console war fueled a different kind of culture, one rooted in economy and ritual. Friday nights meant video rentals. Stores like Blockbuster, Hollywood Video, and local mom and pop shops became the temples of the 16-bit age. Fluorescent lights, carpet that smelled faintly of popcorn, and aisles lined with plastic boxes. Each cartridge waited behind a laminated cover sleeve like a promise. You'd wander the aisles, palms sweaty, deciding your weekend's destiny. Would it be Super Castlevania 4? Gunstar Heroes? Maybe Earthworm Jim if the last kid hadn't beaten you to it. The clerk's small nod as you carried your choice to the counter felt like a blessing. 2 nights. That's all you got. You'd hurry home, tear off the label, and pray it worked on the first try. Renting was its own kind of magic. Temporary ownership, fleeting but personal. You didn't just borrow a game, you borrowed a world. And when you returned it, you left a piece of yourself behind. Across oceans, the war looked different. In Japan, gaming was polite, rooted in craftsmanship and respect. Nintendo's family-oriented ethos resonated deeply with Japanese households, while Sega's arcade lineage drew in the teen crowd. In Europe, the divide was sharper. The Genesis, or Mega Drive, as it was known there, had a punk energy that fit the culture perfectly. It was faster, louder, less polished, and Europeans loved that. Games like Sensible Soccer and Shadow Dancer became regional icons celebrated for their grit. South America, particularly Brazil, became Sega's unexpected kingdom. Tectoy, Sega's local partner, treated the Genesis like national pride. They localized everything, translating manuals, redubbing voices, even creating exclusive games that never left the region. While much of the world had moved on to 3D, Brazil kept the 16-bit spirit alive well into the 2000s. The war's reach extended far beyond technology. It shaped cartoons, lunchboxes, and playground conversations. There were Sonic the Hedgehog cereals, Mario pajamas, Nintendo breakfast plates. The mascots weren't just characters, they were companions. Sonic taught kids to be fast, bold, and mischievous. Mario taught patience, problem solving, optimism. One represented the rush of youth, the other the comfort of home. In America, the 16-bit war even drew the attention of lawmakers. concern over video game violence, especially after Mortal Kombat's gory success on the Genesis, led to congressional hearings in 1993. Suddenly, this was more than entertainment. It was a social debate. Sega's version of Mortal Kombat had blood and fatalities intact. Nintendo's didn't. For the first time, content itself became a battleground. That controversy gave birth to the ESRB, the video game rating system that still exists today. In a strange way, the console war helped legitimize gaming as an art form worth regulating, discussing, and respecting. And through it all, something remarkable happened. The players grew up. The kids who once shouted, "Genesis does what Nintendon't," on playgrounds began to realize the rivalry had shaped them. It had taught them loyalty and curiosity. It had turned them into lifelong fans, and for many, future creators. Some of those kids would go on to design games of their own. Others would write about them, collect them, teach their history. The 16-bit war wasn't just a commercial conflict. It was the origin of gaming culture itself. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not the consoles, but the community they built. When the dust of the console war finally settled, what remained wasn't destruction. It was devotion. An entire generation carried the embers of that 16-bit fire into the future, keeping it alive through music, collecting, and creativity. The 2000s brought progress, but it also brought longing. Games had become bigger, louder, more cinematic. Yet something about the old days still felt warmer. Players missed the click of a cartridge, the tactile sense of ownership, the honesty of simple controls. And so began the quiet rise of nostalgia. Retro soundtracks were the first to return. Before streaming, before Spotify playlists, fans ripped tracks straight from game ROMs and shared them online in MP3 format. What started as piracy quickly evolved into preservation. Sites like Overclocked Remix and VG Music became digital museums filled with fan-made arrangements that treated chiptunes like sacred hymns. You could hear it, that Genesis grit, those SNES harmonies in rock covers, jazz bands, symphonic renditions. Entire orchestras performed medleys of Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VI, and Sonic 2. Crowds cheered, not out of irony but recognition. These weren't just songs, they were memories you could hum. Then came the collectors, guardians of plastic and silicon. At garage sales, flea markets, and early eBay listings, people began searching for the games they'd traded away as kids. Each cartridge held more than data. It held time. The wear on the label, the initials on the back, the way it clicked into place, every detail felt personal. And as those collections grew, so did the reverence. People started framing their old consoles, building display shelves, modding hardware to run on modern TVs. Entire YouTube channels were born around the hum of an old CRT and the click of a power switch. You could say the 16-bit generation was the first to turn technology into art. Not the kind you hang in galleries, but the kind that hums quietly in basements and bedrooms. Reminders that magic doesn't fade, it just changes shape. Merchandise became a second wave of nostalgia. T-shirts with pixel hearts, posters of Mode 7 landscapes, miniature replicas of cartridges turned into keychains. Companies realized what fans had always known, that these machines weren't obsolete, they were emotional anchors. Sega and Nintendo themselves eventually embraced that truth. Nintendo launched the Virtual Console, letting players re-experience classics digitally. Sega reissued its games in compilations and plug-and-play mini-systems. Both companies began curating their histories, not hiding them. The war had ended, but the peace was beautiful. Even in music outside gaming, you could hear the echoes. Electronic artists sampled old sound chips. Vaporwave musicians slowed down Genesis tracks until they felt like dreams. 16-bit aesthetics became shorthand for comfort, a return to something pure and familiar. And through the rise of the internet, the old rivalry found new life in softer form. Forums like NeoGAF and Reddit hosted endless debates about the better console, but now it was playful, nostalgic, self-aware. People weren't defending brands anymore. They were celebrating memories. Those conversations shaped early online identity. Before social media took over, being part of a gaming forum was your digital tribe. You chose avatars, Sonic running, Mario jumping, and carried your allegiance like a badge. The same spirit of competition that once fueled Sega and Nintendo now lived on in modders, speedrunners, and indie developers. Instead of selling consoles, they were building communities. Instead of fighting for dominance, they were preserving heritage. And all the while, the games themselves kept whispering through time. The first time you replay Super Metroid after 20 years, it still feels like stepping into a quiet cathedral. The first time you hear Green Hill Zone's melody, your heart still speeds up like it's 1991 again. That's the strange thing about memory. It doesn't just store data, it stores emotion. Every soundtrack, every sprite, every controller click becomes a bookmark in your life. A reminder of where you were when you first saw those colors, first felt that sense of wonder. For many players, those moments became lifelong companions, silent, loyal, always waiting to be revisited. The 16-bit era didn't just teach us how to play, it taught us how to feel through technology. It proved that emotion could live in circuits, that imagination could survive the passing of time. And as the years passed, that legacy deepened, not as nostalgia for what was lost, but as gratitude for what was given. The war had ended, but its afterglow still warmed the hearts of everyone it touched. If you look closely at today's gaming landscape, you can still see the fingerprints of that 16-bit era, faint, but everywhere. They live in the indie developers who grew up on pixel dreams, in the YouTube historians who treat cartridges like scripture, and in the quiet nostalgia that hums beneath even the most modern console startup sound. Every generation of technology since has grown more complex, but the emotional architecture of gaming, the thing that makes it matter, was built in those 16-bit years. When the lights dim and the screen glows, what we feel isn't just excitement, it's connection to a time when the world seemed smaller, yet somehow infinite. You can see it in the way modern developers talk about their inspirations. Toby Fox, creator of Undertale, has spoken about the influence of Earthbound, how its humor and melancholy made him realize a game could have a soul. The team behind Hollow Knight built a world that feels like a lost SNES dream, full of mystery, patience, and melancholy beauty. Even Celeste, a story about struggle and self-acceptance, wears its 16-bit ancestry proudly. Its pixel art isn't a limitation. It's a love letter. These modern classics carry the same DNA as Super Metroid, Sonic 2, Chrono Trigger, and Final Fantasy VI. They understand what those old games did. That you don't need realism to feel real. You just need honesty. Somewhere between nostalgia and innovation, the 16-bit era found eternal life. It became a template, a design philosophy passed down through time. Make it simple, but meaningful. Make it challenging, but fair. Make it small, but unforgettable. Those lessons echo across genres, across decades. You can feel them in Stardew Valley's quiet cycles of life and love, in Hyperlight Drifter's wordless world building, in the chiptune revival that fills modern playlists with synthetic warmth. Even the way we talk about games, tight controls, fluid animation, perfect difficulty curve, is a language inherited from that golden age. And for those who lived through it, the feeling never fades. The 16-bit era isn't just a memory, it's a rhythm. It beats quietly in the background of every loading screen, every menu chime, every game that dares to mix heart with design. There's something else too, something more personal. The people who played those consoles as kids grew up to build careers, families, and lives shaped by the lessons of that time. They learned persistence from platformers, curiosity from RPGs, creativity from limitations. That's the hidden legacy of Sega and Nintendo's rivalry. It didn't just make better games, it made better dreamers. And while both companies have evolved, their identities still mirror those early days. Nintendo remains the guardian of wonder, deliberate, whimsical, stubbornly original. Sega, though no longer in the console race, continues to chase energy and freedom in its games, forever the rebel spirit. Together, their echoes define what gaming feels like. It's why we smile when we see an 8-bit heart icon in a modern HUD, why we still call a boss fight old school when it challenges us to learn instead of luck out, why even the most advanced open world game feels comforting when it hides a little chime, a little wink from the past. Because deep down, the 16-bit generation taught us that the most powerful part of a game isn't its graphics or its technology. It's that moment when you press start and believe in something again. The screen fades in, the music starts, and for a few precious hours, you're home. That's the real magic of the 16-bit golden age. It wasn't about competition or marketing. It was about meaning. It was about two companies unknowingly teaching us that art could come from rivalry, beauty could come from boundaries, and joy could live forever in a handful of pixels. We still chase that feeling. Every remake, every indie homage, every late night emulator session is a kind of prayer, a way of saying, I remember. And as long as someone remembers, the 16-bit world never truly ends. At night, when the world settles and the screens go dark, there's still a light that lingers, soft, faint, but steady. The glow of memory. The hum of something once alive, still whispering through time. That's the 16-bit age. It lives quietly in us, not just in our collections or nostalgia, but in our sense of wonder, that instinct to believe that simple things can still be beautiful. When you think back on it, the memories aren't just of games. They're of moments. The sound of a cartridge clicking into place, the soft buzz of a CRT filling the room, the flicker of a title screen before the music begins. You remember sitting too close to the TV, knees crossed, controller tangled around your wrist. You remember the thrill of beating a boss after countless tries. That burst of triumph only a child can truly feel. You remember friends on the couch, swapping turns, arguing over whose save file was better. And you remember the quiet, too. Those long solo nights when the rest of the house was asleep and it was just you, the game, and that feeling. The feeling that you'd found a place where you belonged. Those consoles were more than plastic. They were passageways, little machines that taught us patience, perseverance, and joy. They showed us that effort could be rewarding, that discovery could be emotional, that art could be playful. They were teachers disguised as toys. And even now, decades later, the lessons remain. They remind us that progress is a gift, but simplicity is sacred, that creativity thrives under limits, that competition, when born from passion, can shape something timeless. The SNES and Genesis didn't just define an era, they defined a language. The language of pixels and sound, of color and rhythm. A universal tongue that said, come play. Come dream somewhere, out there. Millions of tiny LEDs still blink on old consoles gathering dust. And in that faint light lives an entire generation's heartbeat. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. The swirl of a Super Nintendo logo. The blast of a Sega startup sound. The laughter of kids who didn't yet realize they were living through history. That's what makes nostalgia powerful, not because we want to go back, but because we carry it forward. The 16-bit era isn't something behind us. It's something within us. Every indie game with pixel art. Every orchestra that performs a game theme. Every collector who rescues a forgotten cartridge from a thrift store shelf. They're all keeping that light alive. Sega's defiant spark. Nintendo's enduring calm. Two sides of one eternal melody. It plays quietly still, somewhere, between memory and dream, waiting for us to press start one more time. So tonight, let that glow fill your thoughts. Let it take you back to a time when imagination ruled the world, when stories fit inside small plastic shells, and joy could be measured in megabytes. Because even as technology races ahead, even as our games become vast and endless, we will always return to where it began, to the moment we first believed a handful of pixels could hold the universe. That was the 16-bit golden age, a war that ended in peace, a rivalry that became art, a dream that still hums softly in the dark. Goodnight, Sega. Goodnight, Nintendo. Goodnight, 16-bit world. And so, another story fades into the static of time. If your eyes are still open, take a deep breath and let the glow of old pixels guide you to rest. Tomorrow night, there'll be another world waiting, another memory to dream through. Good night, Player One.